The well had been dry for 11 years when 16-year-old Priya Ashford heard water moving inside it. Nobody else believed her. Her father had capped that well himself when she was 5 years old, standing over it with a look on his face she hadn't fully understood until years later, the specific grief of a man burying something rather than fixing it. The county records called it non-productive. The neighbors called it the dead well without a second thought, the way you'd refer to any ordinary, unremarkable fact about a piece of land. Priya was standing over it on a Tuesday evening in March with her ear pressed nearly to the cracked concrete cap, and she heard, unmistakably, the sound of water moving somewhere beneath her feet. She didn't tell anyone that night. She went back 3 more times that week, at different hours, in different weather, just to be sure she wasn't imagining it. If mysteries hidden in ordinary places and the quiet stubbornness of people who won't stop asking questions mean something to you, subscribe and join us every week. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, we love knowing how far these stories travel. The Ashford place sat on 91 acres in the dry hill country of southwestern Oklahoma, land that had been productive once, decades earlier, when Priya's great-grandfather farmed it with irrigation drawn from 3 separate wells scattered across the property. By the time Priya was born, only one of those wells still ran reliably, the other 2 having failed one by one over the years for reasons nobody had ever fully investigated. Reasons that got filed, eventually, under the general and mostly unquestioned explanation that the water table out there had simply been dropping for decades. The same explanation applied to failing wells across half the county. Priya's father, Marcus Ashford, had inherited the farm from his own father at 29, inheriting along with it 91 acres that had already shrunk, functionally, to closer to 40 acres of consistently farmable ground, the rest sitting fallow or leased out cheap to a neighboring rancher for grazing because there simply wasn't reliable water to work it properly. Marcus had spent most of his adult life managing that shrinkage carefully, keeping the family afloat on less land than his grandfather had once farmed, a fact he rarely discussed directly but that shaped every financial decision the family made. Priya's mother, Denise, worked as a records clerk at the county courthouse in town, a job that had, over the years, given her an unusually thorough understanding of the county's water rights history, old land surveys, and the specific bureaucratic language used to classify wells as productive, marginal, or abandoned, knowledge she rarely had occasion to use at home until the spring everything changed. Priya had one younger brother, Theo, 12, who mostly cared about the dead well as a mildly interesting curiosity, the kind of thing an older sibling got weirdly focused on sometimes, and one older cousin, Rashida, 22, who'd grown up 2 farms over and had moved to Oklahoma City for college but still came back most summers to help during the busiest stretches. It was Priya's grandmother, Opal Ashford, 83, Marcus's mother, still living in a small house at the edge of the property, who first gave Priya a piece of information that changed everything. Opal had lived on that land since marrying into the family 60 years earlier, and she remembered, with the specific clarity elderly people sometimes carry for details from decades past even while forgetting what happened yesterday, the exact year and circumstances under which each of the farm's 3 original wells had failed. The trouble that eventually cracked the mystery open began 3 weeks before Priya first heard the water, when a routine geological survey crew, hired by an energy company scouting the region for an unrelated mineral rights assessment, had come through the property with permission from Marcus, drilling a series of shallow test bores across several sections of the farm, including one within 100 feet of the old capped well nobody had thought about seriously in over a decade. The survey crew's equipment, sensitive to subsurface vibration and groundwater movement in ways that a simple ear pressed to a well cap normally wouldn't be, had apparently disturbed something in the immediate area, though nobody realized it at the time, the crew packing up and moving on to the next property within a day, their actual findings related entirely to mineral deposits and having nothing to do with water at all. Priya, walking the property a few days after the survey crew left, noticed the ground near the old well looking different than she remembered, slightly darker, damper, though she initially dismissed it as nothing more than recent rain pooling somewhere it usually didn't. It was that Tuesday evening, walking past the well on her way back from checking a fence line, that she first heard it. A faint, unmistakable sound of water moving, somewhere below the concrete cap that had sealed the well since she was 5 years old. Here's what Priya didn't yet understand, but began researching seriously over the following weeks, driven by a curiosity that felt, to her, less like a hobby and more like an itch she genuinely couldn't ignore. Wells fail for a range of reasons that have nothing to do with an aquifer simply running dry, the explanation everyone in the county defaulted to without much scrutiny. Sometimes a well's casing collapses or shifts, blocking the flow path between the water table and the well itself without the underlying water source actually disappearing at all. Sometimes sediment or mineral buildup gradually clogs the intake screen at the bottom of a well over years or decades, slowly choking off flow until the well appears, from the surface, to have simply gone dry, when in reality the water is still there, just physically blocked from reaching the surface through the well's original pathway. Priya brought her theory to her father first, tentatively, expecting the same skepticism Owen Prescott had once gotten from Russ over his notebook of earthworm zeros in an entirely different county story. Marcus's actual reaction surprised her. He didn't dismiss it outright, but he was cautious, careful in a way that came from a decade of watching that particular piece of ground disappoint him. "I capped that well myself, Priya," he told her. "Watched it run dry for the better part of a year before I gave up on it. I know what a genuinely dead well sounds like, and it doesn't sound like anything, because there's nothing moving in it." "I'm not saying you're wrong about what happened back then," Priya said. "I'm saying something's different now. I heard water. 3 separate times, 3 different days." Marcus agreed to go listen for himself that evening, mostly, Priya suspected, to put the matter to rest gently rather than out of genuine belief. He knelt at the well cap the way Priya had, pressed his ear close, and went quiet for a long moment. "I hear something," he admitted finally, sitting back on his heels with an expression Priya hadn't seen on her father's face before, something between confusion and a reluctant, cautious hope he clearly didn't fully trust yet. "Might be nothing. Might just be some settling in the casing. But I hear something." It was Opal who provided the piece that turned a curious noise into an actual working theory. Priya visited her grandmother the following weekend, describing what she and her father had heard, and Opal, sitting in her small kitchen with a cup of tea going cold in front of her, told a story Priya had never heard in full detail before. "That well didn't go dry because the water disappeared," Opal said. "There was an earthquake, back in '61, small one. Nobody outside the county probably even recorded it seriously, but it shook things loose all over this part of the state. That well started producing sand not long after, fine grit coming up with the water, more and more of it over the following years, until eventually it just stopped producing anything at all. Your great-grandfather always said he figured the earthquake shifted something down there, cracked the casing or shifted the intake, let sediment start working its way in. Nobody ever pulled the casing to check properly. Cost more than the well was worth to a man already struggling to keep the rest of the farm running." Priya spent the following 2 weeks researching earthquake-related well damage, working from library resources and, with her mother Denise's help, pulling old county records related to well permits and any historical documentation of well casing repairs in the area from the early 1960s. What she found supported Opal's memory closely enough to feel like real confirmation rather than an old woman's half-remembered story. A series of minor earthquakes had indeed been recorded in that part of Oklahoma in 1961, and at least 2 other wells in the surrounding county, according to old permit renewal filings Denise dug up, had been reported as producing sediment or reduced flow in the years immediately following, consistent with casing damage from seismic activity rather than genuine aquifer depletion. If Opal's memory and the historical record were both accurate, the well hadn't actually run dry from a lack of water at all. It had been slowly choked by sediment intrusion through a damaged casing for over a decade before finally, functionally, stopping altogether. And the recent geological survey crew's shallow test bores, drilling within 100 feet of the old well site, might well have disturbed the ground enough to shift something loose again, reopening, even partially, a pathway that had been blocked for years. Marcus, presented with this theory and the supporting research, remained cautiously interested but pointed out, accurately, that a working theory wasn't the same thing as an actual fix. Even if the well genuinely had water moving somewhere below the surface, getting it flowing reliably again would mean actually opening the capped well and investigating the casing directly, a process that carried real cost and real risk given that the well might, once properly inspected, simply confirm it was beyond repair after all, wasting money on a project that would end up exactly where the family had started 12 years earlier. It was Rashida, home for a long weekend that April, who suggested the path forward that actually got the project moving. She'd studied environmental engineering at her university and had, through a professor's connections, some familiarity with the kind of small-scale well rehabilitation work that occasionally got done on old agricultural wells rather than simply drilling new ones from scratch, a cheaper alternative when the underlying water source itself hadn't actually failed. You don't necessarily need to drill a whole new well, Rashida explained, sitting with the family around the kitchen table. If the aquifer's genuinely still there and the problem really is casing damage and sediment blockage, sometimes you can rehabilitate an existing well, clean out the intake screen, repair or reline the damaged casing section, sometimes even just a thorough mechanical or chemical cleaning of the well bore itself can restore flow if the blockage isn't too severe. It's a fraction of the cost of drilling new, if it works. Big if, though. You won't really know until you get down there and look. Marcus, weighing the cost of a professional well rehabilitation assessment against the cost of simply continuing to lease out that section of ground for grazing indefinitely, decided the uncertainty was worth investigating properly, hiring a well contractor from a town 40 minutes away who specialized in exactly this kind of older well rehabilitation work rather than new drilling. The contractor, a practical, unhurried man named Farrell Dietz, came out in early May, and his initial camera inspection, a small waterproof camera lowered down the well bore on a cable, confirmed almost exactly what Opal's story and the family's research had suggested. The well's casing showed clear damage roughly 40 feet down, a cracked and slightly offset section consistent with seismic shifting, with visible sediment buildup below that point that had, over years, essentially sealed off the original intake screen entirely. "Water's still down there," Farrell told the family, reviewing the camera footage with them at the kitchen table. "Questions whether we can clear this sediment and reseal the cracked section well enough to get reliable flow again, or whether the damage runs deeper than what we can see from up here." What followed over the next 3 weeks was slow, methodical work that Priya, given permission by both her father and Farrell to observe and occasionally assist with the less technical parts of the process, found herself genuinely absorbed in far beyond her original curiosity about a strange noise in an old well. Farrell's crew first worked to mechanically clear the sediment blockage, a slow process using specialized equipment lowered down the bore to break up and remove the accumulated grit and fine debris that had built up over more than a decade. The first attempt at clearing the blockage revealed a complication nobody had fully anticipated. The sediment wasn't uniformly loose debris but had, in places, partially cemented itself against the casing wall over the years through natural mineral deposition, a harder, more stubborn blockage than a simple mechanical clearing tool could fully break up on its own. Farrell adjusted his approach, bringing in a specialized chemical treatment designed to help break down mineral cementation without damaging the well's structural integrity, a process that added both time and cost to the project but that, after a second attempt over the following week, succeeded in clearing the intake screen substantially, restoring what the camera inspection now showed as genuine, unobstructed water movement into the lower section of the well bore for the first time in over a decade. The cracked casing section proved more straightforward to address once the sediment issue was resolved, repaired using a specialized liner sleeve that Farrell's crew fitted and sealed within the damaged section, restoring structural integrity without the far greater expense of pulling and replacing the entire casing. By early June, with the repairs complete, Farrell's crew ran a test pump to assess actual flow rate and water quality, a moment the whole family gathered to witness, standing around the wellhead with an anxiety that Priya later described as feeling almost exactly like waiting for exam results. The well produced water immediately, clear and steady, at a flow rate Farrell estimated, after running the test for several hours, at roughly 70% of what the well's original permit record suggested it had produced back before the 1961 earthquake damage began its slow, decade-long process of choking the well off entirely. Marcus stood at the wellhead watching water run steadily into a collection tank for the first time in over a decade, and Priya, standing beside him, noticed something in her father's expression she hadn't fully expected. Not simple relief, but something closer to a complicated grief finally resolving into something else, the specific weight of having capped that well himself years earlier, having made peace with a loss he'd assumed was permanent, now confronting the fact that the loss hadn't actually been permanent at all, just unexamined. "I gave up on this too easily," Marcus said quietly, mostly to himself. "Should have pulled that casing and looked years ago, instead of just assuming the water was gone." "You didn't have the money to gamble on it back then," Priya said. "You made the best call you could with what you knew." "Maybe," Marcus said. "Still should have looked closer." The total cost of the rehabilitation project, once everything was finished, came to just under $14,000. A real expense, but a fraction of the roughly $40,000 a comparable new well, drilled from scratch to the same depth and capacity, would have cost according to Farrell's own estimate, and dramatically cheaper than the cost of continuing to lease out 40 additional acres of unused ground indefinitely, ground that could now, with a second reliable water source restored, potentially return to active cultivation for the first time in over a decade. Word of the restored well spread through the small farming community that summer, and Farrell, hearing the full story of how it had actually come about, an old woman's decades-old memory of an earthquake, a granddaughter's stubborn curiosity about a noise nobody else believed was real, a geological survey crew's incidental disturbance possibly reopening a pathway that had been blocked for years. Mentioned to Marcus that he genuinely never had a rehabilitation project start from quite that specific a combination of circumstances before. "Most of the time somebody calls me because a well's already showing clear signs of partial function, some reduced flow they're trying to restore," Farrell said. "You had a well everybody, including you, had fully written off as completely dead for over a decade." Took a teenager pressing her ear to a concrete cap to even start asking the question again. Opal, informed of the well's full restoration and the confirmation of her decades-old memory of the earthquake, mostly just nodded slowly when Priya told her, the particular satisfaction of someone whose long, mostly unexamined memory had finally been proven not just accurate but genuinely useful. "I always figured that well had more in it than anybody wanted to spend the money finding out," Opal said. "Glad somebody finally cared enough to ask properly." By that fall, Marcus had begun the slower process of bringing the additional acreage the restored well now made viable back into productive use, starting cautiously with a modest planting the following spring rather than attempting to immediately farm the full historical footprint his grandfather had once worked, a careful, incremental approach that Priya suspected her father would have described, if pressed, as simply not wanting to make the same mistake twice of assuming too much too quickly. About ground that had already surprised him once. Priya spent much of that fall and winter continuing to research the property's other historical water infrastructure, working with her mother's access to county records to map exactly what had happened to the third well that had failed decades before the one she'd just helped restore, a well that, according to the same historical permit filings, had failed for entirely different, less hopeful reasons. A genuine aquifer depletion in that specific section of the property rather than mechanical casing damage, a distinction Priya had learned to take seriously rather than assume every old, failed well concealed the same kind of recoverable mystery hers had. "Not every dry well is actually hiding water," she told Theo one evening, the two of them walking the property together the way Priya had once walked it alone, listening for something nobody else believed was there. "Sometimes the water really is gone. You've got to actually check properly instead of just assuming either way." Wendell Berry once wrote that the soil is the great connector of our lives, the source and destination of all. Priya hadn't set out to prove her father wrong about a decision he'd made when she was 5 years old, a decision that had, by every reasonable measure available to him at the time, been the correct one to make. She'd set out because she'd heard something that everyone else, including her own father standing right beside the well, had assumed for over a decade simply couldn't be there, and she trusted that sound enough to keep asking questions until somebody with the right expertise could tell her, definitively, whether she was right or simply hearing what she wanted to hear. Priya is 17 now. She's already talked with her father about hiring Farrell to run a proper camera inspection on the farm's third, long-failed well, not because she has any specific reason yet to believe it holds the same kind of recoverable mystery the second well did, but because she's learned, over the course of that spring and summer, that the difference between dead and dormant is sometimes a question worth asking properly instead of simply accepting as settled, however reasonable the original assumption might have seemed at the time. Opal still tells the story of the 1961 earthquake to anyone who'll listen, though these days she tells it with a new ending attached, the one where a curious teenager finally proved the old memory was worth something after all. What's something in your own life that everyone assumed was permanently lost, that turned out to just be waiting for somebody patient enough to look closer? Tell us in the comments, we read every one. And if stories like this one mean something to you, subscribe. We'd love to have you along.